When you think of Roman emperors meeting their end, you probably picture swift assassinations by ambitious senators in marble corridors or heroic deaths on distant battlefields defending the empire. But there was another emperor whose death required not one but multiple attempts on a single night, each more desperate than the last, until his own wrestling partner finally succeeded where poison had failed. In the dying hours of December 31st, 192, as Rome prepared to celebrate the dawn of a new year, the most powerful man in the known world lay writhing in his private bath, while the hands of a trusted athlete closed around his throat in the flickering candlelight. This was no ordinary assassination. This was the culmination of months of careful planning by conspirators who understood that killing this particular emperor would require extraordinary measures. The man they sought to eliminate was not merely another corrupt ruler or weak tyrant. He was Lucius Aurelius Commodus, son of the revered Marcus Aurelius, but transformed into something his philosopher father could never have imagined. A gladiator emperor who believed himself to be the god Hercules reborn, a megalomaniac who had renamed Rome itself after his own glory. A killer who murdered senators and citizens alike for sport in the arena, while the crowd cheered his divine performance. The conspirators knew that conventional assassination methods might fail against a man who had spent years training his body for combat, who fought wild beasts for entertainment, and who surrounded himself with guards who worshipped his supposed divinity. They would need to use subtlety first, brute force second, and ultimately the intimate knowledge of someone who knew his daily routines better than anyone else alive. The wrestling champion Narcissus had shared training sessions with Commodus for years. He knew every muscle, every weakness, every habit of the emperor's body. He would prove to be the perfect instrument of death. The setting for this imperial murder was not the forum or the Senate house, but the private quarters of a palace that had been transformed into a shrine to one man's delusions of godhood. Statues of Commodus, dressed as Hercules, lined the corridors, while the months of the year bore names he had chosen to glorify his own imagined virtues. The very air of Rome had been poisoned by 12 years of increasingly erratic rule that had pushed the empire's governing class beyond the limits of tolerance. The conspirators who gathered in those final days of December knew they were not just planning a murder. They were attempting to save what remained of Roman civilization from complete collapse. What you will discover about the final hours of Commodus will challenge everything you thought you knew about the nature of imperial power and the lengths to which desperate people will go to preserve their world from madness. This is not a story of noble Romans defending the Republic against tyranny. It is the darker tale of how absolute power corrupts absolutely, and how that corruption eventually creates the very conditions for its own destruction. The death of Commodus would not restore Rome to its former glory. Instead, it would plunge the empire into a civil war that would consume thousands of lives and fundamentally alter the nature of imperial rule forever. The Roman Empire that shaped young Commodus was a civilization at the absolute pinnacle of its power and cultural achievement, ruled by Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor whose meditations would endure as one of history's greatest works of Stoic wisdom. Yet this same golden age that produced such intellectual and moral refinement would also nurture the man who would become its antithesis. Born on August 31st, 161, at Lanuvium, just 14 miles southeast of Rome, Lucius Aurelius Commodus entered the world as the first emperor's son to be born, while his father actually held imperial power. a circumstance that should have prepared him perfectly for the responsibilities he would inherit, but instead seemed to convince him that rulership was his divine birthright rather than a burden of service. Marcus Aurelius had spent his life wrestling with the fundamental questions of duty, mortality, and the proper use of power, filling his private notebooks with reflections that revealed a man who viewed imperial authority as a cosmic responsibility requiring constant self-examination and moral discipline. His court was filled with philosophers, historians, and legal scholars who engaged in sophisticated discussions about ethics, governance, and the nature of justice. This was an emperor who genuinely believed that the purpose of power was to serve others, who rose before dawn to attend to imperial business, and who spent long nights studying the complexities of administration and law. The young Commodus was raised in this environment of intellectual rigor and moral seriousness, receiving the finest education available in the ancient world, from tutors who had been carefully selected for their wisdom and character. He studied rhetoric, philosophy, mathematics, and literature under men who had dedicated their lives to learning and who expected their imperial pupil to embrace the same values of disciplined inquiry and ethical reflection that had made his father one of history's most respected rulers. The boy showed early promise in physical activities, demonstrating natural athletic ability and a keen interest in military training that pleased his father and suggested he might develop into an effective warrior emperor. Yet even in these early years, careful observers might have detected warning signs that suggested Commodus was developing a fundamentally different relationship with power and authority than his father intended. While Marcus Aurelius approached physical training as a discipline that built character and prepared the body for the hardships of military service, his son seemed drawn to athletics, primarily for the admiration and attention they brought him. The boy who should have been learning humility and self-control from his stoic tutors, instead appeared to be developing an appetite for praise and public recognition that would grow more pronounced with each passing year. The contrast between father and son became more apparent as Commodus entered adolescence and began accompanying Marcus Aurelius on military campaigns along the Danube frontier. These expeditions were intended to provide practical education in leadership, strategy, and the harsh realities of imperial responsibility, but the young prince seemed more interested in the pageantry and excitement of military life than in the serious business of defending Roman civilization against barbarian incursions. While his father spent long hours in conference with generals and provincial administrators, working through the complex logistics of frontier defense and tribal diplomacy, Commodus gravitated toward the company of gladiator trainers and athletic instructors who flattered his physical prowess and encouraged his growing obsession with combat sports. The philosophical foundations that Marcus Aurelius had hoped to instill in his heir were systematically undermined by the young man's preference for immediate pleasures over long-term character development. Instead of embracing Stoic teachings about duty, self-discipline, and the temporary nature of earthly power, Commodus began to develop a worldview that placed his own desires and ambitions at the center of the universe. The emperor, who had written extensively about the importance of recognizing one's own mortality and limitations, was raising a son who seemed incapable of accepting any constraints on his will or any criticism of his actions. Contemporary sources, particularly the senator and historian Cassius Dio, who observed the imperial court firsthand during this period, describe a young man who combined impressive physical capabilities with troubling psychological tendencies that became more pronounced as he matured. Dio, who had every reason to present the imperial family in a favorable light, could not entirely conceal his concerns about the crown prince's character development. The historian's carefully diplomatic language nevertheless reveals a pattern of behavior that suggested Commodus was learning all the wrong lessons from his position of privilege. The political and social environment of the 170s provided numerous opportunities for a young aristocrat to indulge his worst impulses, while still maintaining the appearance of proper imperial conduct. The Roman court was filled with flatterers and sycophants who understood that their own advancement depended on pleasing the emperor's family, and many of these individuals were perfectly willing to encourage the young prince's vanity and self-indulgence if it might win them favor with the future ruler. Gladiator trainers in particular found in Commodus an eager student who brought imperial resources and prestige to their profession while providing them with unprecedented access to power and influence. The gladiatorial schools of Rome had always occupied an ambiguous position in Roman society, providing entertainment that was both beloved by the masses and viewed with suspicion by the traditional elite. These institutions combined athletic training with theatrical performance in ways that appealed to Commodus's dual desires for physical challenge and public attention. Unlike the military training that his father considered essential for imperial education, gladiatorial combat offered the prince an opportunity to excel in skills that were designed primarily for entertainment rather than practical application in war or governance. The cultural tensions that would ultimately define Commodus's reign were already apparent in his adolescent fascination with gladiatorial combat and his growing identification with mythological heroes rather than historical role models. While Marcus Aurelius had encouraged his son to study the lives and achievements of great emperors like Augustus and Trajan, the young prince seemed more interested in the legendary exploits of figures like Hercules, whose divine parentage and supernatural strength placed him beyond the normal constraints that governed mortal rulers. This preference for mythological rather than historical models of leadership would prove to be one of the most revealing aspects of Commodus's psychological development. The religious and philosophical framework that had sustained the Roman Empire for centuries was gradually being undermined by the very man who was supposed to embody its highest values. Marcus Aurelius had understood imperial power as a form of cosmic duty that required the emperor to subordinate his personal desires to the needs of the empire and its people. His son was developing a radically different conception of rulership that placed the emperor above ordinary moral and legal constraints, answerable only to the gods whose favor he believed he enjoyed by virtue of his birth and abilities. The educational program that had been designed to prepare Commodus for responsible leadership was failing in ways that would not become fully apparent until after his father's death. But the signs of that failure were already visible to anyone who chose to look carefully at the young man's behavior and attitudes. Instead of learning to view power as a burden that required constant vigilance and self-sacrifice, he was coming to see it as a tool for personal gratification and self-expression. The philosopher's son was becoming something his father could never have imagined or intended, but the momentum of these psychological changes would prove impossible to reverse once they were set in motion. The death of Marcus Aurelius in 180 created the conditions for Commodus to assume full imperial authority at the age of 18, bringing to the throne a young man whose character had been shaped by years of flattery and indulgence rather than the systematic preparation that effective leadership required. The transition from heir apparent to absolute ruler represented a fundamental change in the psychological and social pressures that had previously constrained his behavior. removing the final external checks on impulses and desires that had been growing stronger throughout his adolescence. The transformation of Commodus from a privileged but ostensibly normal young aristocrat into the monster who would terrorize Rome began in earnest during the year 182, when his older sister Lucilla orchestrated what should have been a straightforward palace coup, but instead became the catalyzing event that revealed the true depths of her brother's capacity for systematic cruelty and paranoid revenge. The failed assassination attempt that spring would mark the end of whatever restraint or humanity had still existed within the young emperor's character, replacing it with a calculating viciousness that would define the remaining decade of his reign and ultimately lead to his own violent death. Lucilla had been empress herself during her marriage to Lucius Verus, the co-emperor who had died in 169, and she had never fully accepted her reduced status following her brother's rise to sole imperial power. She was a woman of considerable intelligence and political sophistication, who understood the mechanisms of palace intrigue and possessed the connections necessary to organize a serious challenge to Commodus's authority. Her grievances against her brother were both personal and political, reflecting her belief that he was proving unworthy of the throne their father had bequeathed to him, and her conviction that she could provide more effective leadership for the empire. The specific circumstances that led to Lucilla's decision to attempt assassination reveal the depth of her concerns about Commodus's fitness for imperial responsibility and her growing recognition that conventional forms of family influence would be insufficient to moderate his increasingly erratic behavior. The emperor's neglect of administrative duties in favor of gladiatorial training, his casual dismissal of experienced advisors who attempted to provide honest counsel, and his apparent indifference to the mounting problems facing the empire's frontiers had convinced his sister that drastic action was necessary to prevent the complete collapse of effective governance. The plot itself was relatively simple in conception but fatally flawed in execution, revealing both the conspirators' desperation and their fundamental misunderstanding of how completely Commodus had already consolidated his power within the imperial system. Lucilla recruited two senators, Claudius Pompeianus Quintianus and Quintilius Condianus, along with several other members of the Roman elite who shared her concerns about the emperor's increasingly erratic behavior and his apparent disregard for traditional forms of senatorial consultation and cooperation. The recruitment process for this conspiracy reveals important information about the political atmosphere in Rome during the early years of Commodus's reign, and the extent to which members of the traditional governing class had already begun to view the young emperor as a threat to their own interests and to the stability of the imperial system. The senators who agreed to participate in Lucilla's plot were not merely ambitious individuals seeking personal advancement, but respected figures who had served the empire with distinction and who possessed sufficient experience to recognize the dangers that Commodus's incompetence and irresponsibility posed to Roman civilization. The plan called for Quintianus to approach Commodus as he entered the Colosseum for one of the gladiatorial exhibitions that had already become a signature feature of his reign, then to stab the emperor with a concealed dagger while shouting a proclamation that would identify the attack as the will of the Roman Senate rather than a merely personal vendetta. This public setting was chosen deliberately to maximize the political impact of the assassination and to demonstrate that opposition to Commodus extended beyond the imperial family to include respected members of the traditional governing class. The selection of the Colosseum as the site for the assassination attempt was symbolically appropriate, as this was the venue where Commodus had begun to display the gladiatorial obsessions that would eventually consume his reign and transform him from a conventional autocrat into something far more dangerous and unpredictable. The building that had been constructed to celebrate Roman military victories and to provide entertainment for the masses was becoming the stage for the emperor's personal fantasies about combat and divine favor, making it a fitting location for an attempt to end his increasingly delusional rule. But Quintianus's behavior at the crucial moment revealed either catastrophic nervousness or a fundamental misunderstanding of what effective assassination required. Instead of approaching quickly and striking without warning, he chose to announce his intentions by raising his dagger and declaring loudly, "This is what the Senate has sent you." This theatrical gesture, which might have been effective in a dramatic performance, provided exactly the warning that Commodus's guards needed to intervene before any actual harm could be done to the emperor. Within seconds, Quintianus was overpowered and disarmed, while his fellow conspirators found themselves identified and arrested before they could escape or attempt to complete their mission. The failure of this assassination attempt can be attributed to several factors that reveal important aspects of both the conspirators' psychology and the security arrangements that protected imperial authority during this period. The decision to announce their political motivations before striking suggests that the conspirators were more concerned with making a symbolic statement about senatorial opposition than with actually killing the emperor, while their choice of a public venue for the attack demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of the practical requirements for successful political violence against well-protected targets. The young emperor's reaction to this betrayal by his own sister and the senatorial class revealed aspects of his character that had previously been hidden beneath the veneer of imperial dignity and aristocratic breeding. Rather than responding with the measured justice that Roman tradition expected from rulers facing political opposition, Commodus unleashed a wave of executions, tortures, and confiscations that demonstrated both his personal vindictiveness and his complete disregard for the legal protections that had traditionally shielded members of the Roman elite from arbitrary imperial violence. The interrogations that followed the failed coup were conducted with a systematic brutality that shocked even hardened observers of imperial politics. Commodus personally supervised the questioning of suspected conspirators, displaying an enthusiasm for their suffering that suggested he was discovering genuine pleasure in the exercise of absolute power over life and death. The emperor, who had been raised on Stoic philosophy about the importance of emotional restraint and rational judgment, was revealing himself to be driven by passions and impulses that his father would have found incomprehensible. The specific methods used to extract confessions and information from the suspected conspirators revealed aspects of Commodus's character that would become increasingly prominent as his reign progressed. He appeared to take personal satisfaction in devising creative forms of suffering for his victims, displaying an imagination for cruelty that suggested deep psychological disturbance rather than mere political calculation. The emperor was learning that absolute power provided opportunities for indulging impulses and desires that would have been constrained in any other context. The psychological transformation that this experience produced in Commodus was perhaps even more significant than its immediate political consequences, as the knowledge that respected members of the Roman elite had actively plotted his death seemed to awaken paranoid tendencies that would gradually consume more and more of his mental energy and decision-making capacity. The emperor, who had previously shown at least occasional concern for traditional forms of consultation and cooperation with the governing class, was becoming convinced that he was surrounded by enemies who required constant surveillance and preemptive elimination. Lucilla herself was subjected to a more sophisticated form of punishment that demonstrated the emperor's growing skill at psychological torture and his understanding of how public humiliation could be more devastating than simple physical destruction. She was stripped of her imperial titles, exiled from Rome, and forced to live under constant surveillance while watching her supporters and allies suffer the deaths that had been intended for her. This calculated cruelty revealed that Commodus possessed not only the capacity for impulsive violence, but also the intelligence and patience necessary for systematic revenge. The broader implications of Commodus's response to the conspiracy extended far beyond the immediate fate of the individuals who had participated in it. The emperor's willingness to use torture and execution against members of the senatorial class represented a fundamental break with the traditions of political restraint that had allowed the Roman elite to maintain some degree of autonomy and security, even under autocratic rule. Previous emperors, even those known for their severity, had generally respected certain boundaries in their treatment of aristocratic opponents. Commodus was demonstrating that he recognized no such limitations on his power. The public nature of the executions that followed Lucilla's conspiracy served multiple purposes that revealed the calculating intelligence behind Commodus's apparent brutality. These spectacles were designed not merely to punish the individuals who had opposed him, but to send a clear message to any potential future conspirators about the consequences of challenging imperial authority. The emperor was using terror as a deliberate tool of governance, systematically breaking down the psychological barriers that might otherwise encourage opposition to his rule. The victims of this first wave of imperial violence included some of the most respected members of Roman society, men whose families had served the empire with distinction for generations and whose personal reputations had previously placed them beyond the reach of arbitrary imperial persecution. The execution of such individuals sent shock waves throughout the Roman elite and began the process of psychological intimidation that would characterize the remaining years of Commodus's reign. No one could feel safe if senators of unquestioned loyalty and distinguished ancestry could be tortured and killed on the emperor's whims. Contemporary observers, particularly Cassius Dio, who was serving as a senator during this period and witnessed these events firsthand, struggled to reconcile the Commodus they were seeing with the young man who had been raised in Marcus Aurelius's household and educated according to the finest philosophical traditions. The transformation seemed so complete and so rapid that some wondered whether the emperor was suffering from some form of mental illness or divine punishment that had corrupted his previously stable character. The conspiracy's failure also had important consequences for the development of effective opposition to Commodus's rule. As the emperor's violent response eliminated many of the most experienced and capable individuals who might have organized future resistance efforts, the senators and officials who survived this purge learned to keep their criticisms and concerns to themselves, creating an atmosphere of fear and suspicion that made coordinated opposition increasingly difficult to organize and maintain. The 3 years following Lucilla's conspiracy witnessed a gradual but systematic transformation in Commodus's understanding of his own nature and role that went far beyond mere political paranoia to encompass a fundamental reimagining of the relationship between imperial authority and divine power. The emperor, who had initially been content to rule as a mortal autocrat, began to develop elaborate theological justifications for his increasingly arbitrary behavior, constructing a personal mythology that placed him at the center of cosmic events and elevated his whims to the status of divine commandments that no mortal authority could question or resist. The initial manifestations of this psychological transformation were subtle enough that experienced courtiers and political observers might have dismissed them as temporary aberrations brought on by the stress of surviving an assassination attempt and the burden of eliminating so many members of the traditional governing class. The emperor began to spend increasing amounts of time consulting with astrologers, dream interpreters, and various religious specialists who claimed to possess special insight into the will of the gods and the cosmic significance of earthly events. These consultations gradually evolved from occasional diversions into daily necessities, as Commodus became convinced that ordinary human intelligence was insufficient for understanding the complex spiritual forces that governed imperial boss decision-making. The practical consequences of this shift were immediately apparent to anyone responsible for imperial administration, as routine governmental business was increasingly delayed or disrupted by the emperor's need to obtain divine guidance before making even relatively minor decisions about appointments, budgets, or policy implementation. The personnel changes that accompanied this theological reorientation revealed the extent to which Commodus was systematically replacing competent administrators with individuals whose primary qualification was their willingness to support his divine pretensions rather than their ability to manage complex governmental responsibilities. Experienced civil servants and military officers who had served the empire with distinction for decades found themselves dismissed or transferred to insignificant positions, while their replacements were chosen primarily for their enthusiasm about the emperor's supposed supernatural status. The physical transformation of the imperial palace during this period reflected Commodus's growing obsession with creating an environment that would properly reflect his divine nature and provide appropriate settings for the religious ceremonies that were becoming an increasingly important part of his daily routine. Traditional Roman artwork celebrating military victories and constitutional achievements was systematically removed and replaced with mythological scenes that depicted the labors of Hercules or the interventions of Jupiter in human affairs. The emperor's private apartments were redesigned to resemble temples rather than living quarters, complete with altars, sacred vessels, and elaborate decorative schemes that emphasized his connection to divine rather than earthly authority. Visitors to the imperial court found themselves required to participate in purification rituals before approaching the emperor, who now insisted on being addressed with religious formulas that treated him as a living god rather than a mortal ruler deserving respect and obedience. The theological implications of these changes created profound confusion and resentment throughout Roman society, as traditional religious authorities struggled to accommodate demands for worship that contradicted fundamental principles about the relationship between mortal and divine authority. The imperial cult, which had always maintained careful distinctions between honors paid to living emperors and actual worship reserved for deified rulers after their deaths, was being systematically corrupted by requirements that violated basic religious doctrine and created impossible situations for conscientious believers. The emperor's growing identification with Hercules represented perhaps the most psychologically revealing aspect of his divine transformation, as this particular deity embodied qualities and experiences that seemed to correspond closely with Commodus's own understanding of his imperial role and personal destiny. Hercules was simultaneously divine and human, possessing supernatural strength and the favor of Jupiter, while also experiencing the challenges and temptations that characterized mortal existence. More importantly, the legendary hero had earned his divine status through great deeds and heroic labors, rather than inheriting it by birth or political appointment. The adoption of Hercules as his divine prototype provided Commodus with both psychological justification for his increasingly erratic behavior and practical cover for activities that might otherwise have been criticized as inappropriate for imperial dignity. If the emperor was indeed the reincarnation of history's greatest hero, then his participation in gladiatorial combat and his fascination with physical contests were not unseemly indulgences, but sacred duties that demonstrated his divine nature to subjects who needed tangible proof of his supernatural status. The costume changes that accompanied this theological development were dramatic enough to shock even courtiers who had grown accustomed to the emperor's eccentric behavior, as Commodus began appearing in public wearing the lion's skin and carrying the massive club that mythology associated with Hercules. These garments were not merely theatrical props, but sacred vestments that the emperor believed were necessary for properly channeling divine power and maintaining his connection to the cosmic forces that governed imperial authority. The renaming campaigns that began in earnest during 191 represented the most visible and systematic manifestation of Commodus's megalomaniacal ambitions, as he attempted to reshape the entire Roman world according to his divine vision. The months of the year were rechristened to reflect various aspects of his supposed godhood. January became Amazonius, honoring his role as protector of the Amazon warriors who served in his gladiatorial performances, while February was renamed Invictus to celebrate his invincible nature, and March became Felix to commemorate his divine happiness and favor. These administrative changes required extensive bureaucratic effort to implement throughout the empire, as provincial governors and local officials were required to update all official documents, adjust their calendar systems, and ensure that the emperor's new nomenclature was properly observed in all governmental communications. The practical disruption caused by these reforms was enormous, but the symbolic significance was even greater, as Commodus was effectively declaring that Roman time itself would henceforth be organized around celebrations of his divine attributes, rather than traditional religious and seasonal observances. The city of Rome itself underwent the most dramatic transformation, becoming Colonia Lucia Annia Commodiana in honor of the emperor's divine refounding of the eternal city. This renaming was accompanied by massive construction projects designed to create physical monuments to Commodus's divine nature, including a colossal statue of himself as Hercules that would dominate the skyline and serve as a constant reminder of his supernatural status to anyone approaching the city by land or sea. The harbor facilities that brought grain and other essential supplies to Rome were renamed Portus Commodianus, while the Roman fleet that maintained crucial supply lines from Egypt and North Africa became the Classis Commodiana Herculea. Even the Praetorian Guard, which was responsible for protecting the emperor's life and maintaining order within the capital, was redesignated as the Cohorts Commodianae to emphasize their service to a divine rather than merely imperial master. The psychological isolation that resulted from these divine pretensions became increasingly complete as Commodus surrounded himself with individuals who either shared his delusions or were willing to participate in them for personal advantage. The rational advisors and experienced administrators who had provided his father with realistic assessments of imperial conditions were gradually replaced by flatterers and sycophants, whose primary qualification was their enthusiasm for the emperor's supposed divinity rather than their competence in governance or military affairs. The religious ceremonies that became a daily feature of imperial routine during this period were elaborate productions that required extensive preparation and coordination, while serving no practical governmental purpose beyond reinforcing Commodus's delusions about his divine nature. These rituals consumed hours that should have been devoted to administrative business, while creating additional financial burdens for an imperial treasury that was already strained by the costs of the emperor's gladiatorial exhibitions and construction projects. The impact of these changes on the broader Roman population was profound and lasting, as citizens who had grown up respecting traditional distinctions between mortal and divine authority found themselves required to participate in religious observances that contradicted their fundamental beliefs about the proper relationship between rulers and subjects. The emperor's divine pretensions were not merely personal eccentricities, but systematic challenges to the theological and philosophical foundations that had sustained Roman civilization for centuries. The gladiatorial obsessions that had begun during Commodus's youth as a disturbing but relatively harmless fascination with athletic competition evolved during the middle years of his reign into something far more sinister, revealing. As the emperor transformed the sacred Colosseum into his personal theater for systematic murder, while developing increasingly elaborate justifications for activities that violated every principle of civilized entertainment and imperial grace. Dignity. The spectacles that he organized and personally participated in represented not merely the corruption of traditional Roman games, but the creation of an entirely new form of imperial theater in which the emperor's supposed divine nature was demonstrated through his ability to kill helpless victims, while audiences were forced to cheer performances they knew to be morally reprehensible. The evolution of these performances, from conventional gladiatorial contests to elaborate murder rituals, reveals the systematic nature of Commodus's psychological deterioration and his growing disconnection from any rational understanding of appropriate imperial behavior. The emperor, who had initially contented himself with fighting against professional gladiators in relatively fair contests, gradually began to demand opponents who were physically handicapped, mentally impaired, or deliberately weakened to ensure that his victories would be both certain and dramatic. The specific victim selection processes that characterize these later spectacles demonstrate the calculating intelligence behind what might otherwise appear to be random acts of sadistic violence. Commodus and his assistants developed elaborate criteria for choosing individuals whose deaths would provide maximum theatrical impact while serving the broader purpose of demonstrating the emperor's divine power over life and death. Disabled citizens were particularly favored because their physical limitations made resistance impossible, while their deformities could be interpreted as evidence of divine disfavor that justified their elimination as acts of cosmic justice rather than mere cruelty. The most infamous of these performances involved Commodus's recreation of mythological scenes that required living human beings to play the roles of monsters and victims in deadly tableaux that combined religious pageantry with systematic execution. When the emperor decided to reenact Hercules' legendary battle against the giants, he ordered that all the men in Rome who had lost their feet to disease or accident be brought to the arena, where they were fitted with prosthetic serpent tails and given sponges to throw instead of stones, before being clubbed to death with a massive wooden weapon, while the emperor pretended they were supernatural enemies requiring divine intervention to defeat. The preparation required for these murderous spectacles reveals the extent to which imperial resources and administrative capacity were being diverted from legitimate governmental functions to support one man's psychological pathology. Teams of palace servants worked for weeks to organize each performance, coordinating with gladiatorial schools to provide proper training and equipment, while liaising with city officials to ensure adequate supplies of victims who met the emperor's specific requirements for physical condition, ethnic background, or symbolic significance. The costume departments that had traditionally provided authentic equipment for legitimate gladiatorial contests were transformed into workshops for creating props and stage effects designed to enhance the theatrical impact of imperial murder rather than to support genuine athletic competition. Skilled craftsmen, who should have been contributing their talents to useful construction projects, instead devoted their time to fabricating elaborate mechanical devices that would make the emperor's killings more visually spectacular, while providing plausible cover for what everyone understood to be rigged contests against helpless opponents. The animal hunts that formed another major component of Commodus's gladiatorial career demonstrate his complete abandonment of the traditional Roman values of courage and fair play that were supposed to characterize aristocratic behavior. Rather than engaging in genuine tests of skill against dangerous predators, the emperor systematically arranged exhibitions in which exotic beasts were drugged, physically restrained, or otherwise incapacitated to ensure that he could defeat them without significant risk, while appearing to demonstrate supernatural courage and hunting ability to audiences who were expected to pretend they believed in the authenticity of his achievements. The scale and expense of these fraudulent spectacles represented a massive diversion of imperial wealth, from essential governmental functions to the gratification of one man's ego and the reinforcement of his psychological delusions. Rare animals were transported from the furthest reaches of the empire at enormous cost, not for legitimate gladiatorial contests, but for staged performances in which the outcome was predetermined, and the only real purpose was to provide the emperor with opportunities to display his supposed divine prowess before captive audiences who had no choice but to express appropriate enthusiasm for his achievements. The logistics required to maintain these elaborate deceptions reveal the extent to which the imperial administration had become subordinated to serving Commodus's personal fantasies, rather than addressing the practical needs of governing a vast and complex empire. Provincial governors found themselves required to divert resources and personnel from frontier defense and infrastructure maintenance to support the emperor's demands for exotic animals, unusual victims, and elaborate stage effects that served no purpose beyond reinforcing his delusions about his divine nature and supernatural abilities. The psychological impact of these events on their audiences provides crucial insight into the broader social corruption that Commodus's reign was creating throughout Roman society. Citizens who attended these spectacles understood that they were witnessing systematic murder rather than legitimate entertainment, but their physical safety and economic security depended on demonstrating appropriate enthusiasm for performances they knew to be morally reprehensible and spiritually corrupting. The emperor's divine pretensions provided a thin veneer of religious justification for activities that everyone recognized as sadistic cruelty, but refusing to show proper appreciation for his supposed supernatural achievements could result in accusations of impiety or disloyalty that might prove fatal. The collective complicity that these circumstances created had profound, long-term consequences for Roman moral and political culture. As citizens learned to participate in systematic deception while suppressing their natural revulsion at imperial behavior they knew to be fundamentally wrong. The religious dimensions of these performances created additional layers of blasphemy and corruption that horrified traditional Romans who understood the proper relationships between mortal and divine authority. By presenting his gladiatorial activities as sacred rituals that demonstrated his divine nature, Commodus was systematically profaning the religious traditions that provided spiritual foundation for Roman civilization, while demanding that his subjects participate in ceremonies that violated their deepest moral and theological convictions. The economic consequences of these spectacles extended far beyond their immediate costs to encompass broader damage to imperial finances and administrative efficiency that would persist long after Commodus's death. The resources consumed by his gladiatorial exhibitions could have funded significant improvements to frontier fortifications, road networks, aqueduct systems, and other infrastructure projects that would have benefited the entire empire rather than serving merely to gratify one man's psychological disorders. The military implications of the emperor's arena activities were particularly serious, as professional soldiers who should have been learning strategy, logistics, and leadership from their commander-in-chief instead found themselves witnessing performances that demonstrated his complete disconnection from the practical requirements of military service and his preference for theatrical violence over genuine martial skills. The emperor, who was responsible for defending Roman civilization against barbarian invasion, was revealing himself to be more interested in staging elaborate murders than in addressing the real security challenges facing his empire. The corruption of traditional Roman values that resulted from these spectacles extended far beyond the immediate participants to influence the broader culture in ways that would persist long after Commodus's own death. Citizens who had been required to cheer and applaud systematic murder were learning to accept levels of cruelty and degradation that previous generations would have found intolerable, while the institutions that were supposed to protect civilized behavior were being systematically undermined by an emperor who treated human life as raw material for his entertainment rather than recognizing the fundamental dignity that had traditionally been accorded to Roman citizens. The conspiracy that would finally end Commodus's reign began to crystallize during the autumn of 192 through a stroke of fortune that revealed how completely the emperor had lost touch with basic security, precautions, and rational decision-making processes. The discovery that would transform his most trusted associates from loyal servants into desperate assassins occurred through the agency of a young boy named Commodus, who served as a page in the imperial household and was favored by the emperor for his beauty, intelligence, and apparent innocence of the corruption that characterized most palace relationships. The child's access to Commodus's private chambers was a privilege that reflected both the emperor's genuine affection for him and his complete confidence in the boy's loyalty and discretion. Unlike the adults who surrounded the imperial court, Commodus had not yet learned to dissemble or flatter, providing Commodus with what he believed to be honest companionship and genuine admiration that were increasingly rare in his isolated and paranoid existence. The emperor's trust in the boy was absolute, which made him careless about securing sensitive documents when the child was present in his private quarters. The fateful evening when the conspiracy began, Commodus had spent several hours in his private study, working on what he believed to be his final preparations for a comprehensive purge of potential enemies that would permanently secure his divine authority against any future challenges. The death list that he compiled during these sessions represented the culmination of months of paranoid speculation about the loyalty of various palace officials, military commanders, and even family members who might theoretically pose threats to his continued rule. The document itself was written in the emperor's own hand, reflecting his unwillingness to trust even his closest associates with knowledge of his intentions until the moment when their cooperation would be essential for implementing his murderous plans. The list contained not merely names, but detailed annotations about each intended victim's supposed crimes, their connections to previous conspiracies, and the specific methods that should be employed for their elimination. This was not a hasty compilation of suspects, but a carefully considered catalogue of everyone whom Commodus believed posed even the slightest risk to his divine authority. When the emperor was summoned to his evening bath by attendants who were unaware of the document's significance, he left the writing tablet carelessly on his desk, confident that his private chambers were secure and that no one would dare to examine his personal papers without explicit permission. The physical layout of the imperial quarters normally provided excellent security for such sensitive materials, but the presence of young Commodus created an exception that Commodus had not considered when planning his security arrangements. The boy's discovery of the tablet was entirely accidental, as he had been instructed to tidy the emperor's study while his master was bathing, and had picked up what he assumed to be a routine administrative document that had been left out of place. The child's ability to read had been one of the qualities that endeared him to Commodus, who enjoyed having someone who could assist with simple clerical tasks while providing companionship during the long hours he spent on imperial business. But when Commodus glanced at the tablet's contents, he quickly realized that this was not ordinary imperial correspondence, but something far more serious and dangerous. The boy's education had been sufficient to allow him to understand the significance of what he was reading, and his natural intelligence enabled him to grasp immediately the implications of his discovery for the people whose names appeared on the emperor's death list. The child's loyalty to Commodus was genuine and deep, but his affection for Marcia, who had always treated him with maternal kindness and had often protected him from the harsher aspects of palace life, created a moral conflict that he was too young to resolve through philosophical reasoning. The practical decision he faced was whether to remain silent about his discovery and allow the executions to proceed as planned, or to warn the intended victims about their danger while risking his own life if his betrayal of imperial confidence was discovered. When Marcia encountered the boy carrying the tablet through the palace corridors, her initial reaction was mild annoyance at what appeared to be another instance of childish curiosity about imperial business that should have been left undisturbed. Her intention was simply to take the document from him and return it to its proper place before Commodus discovered that his papers had been disturbed, but the child's obvious distress and his urgent whispers about the tablet's contents quickly convinced her that something far more serious was involved. Marcia's ability to read the emperor's handwriting came from years of intimate association with his personal habits and administrative practices, as she had often assisted him with correspondence and record-keeping during the early years of their relationship. when he had still maintained some pretense of normal imperial business. Her literacy was one of the qualities that had originally attracted Commodus to her, as he appreciated having a companion who could participate intelligently in discussions about governmental affairs, while providing the emotional support that his increasingly isolated position required. But nothing in her experience had prepared her for the contents of what she discovered when she examined the tablet that Commodus had brought to her attention. The woman who had shared the emperor's bed for years and had participated in his most private moments found herself confronting the stark reality that her devotion and service had earned her nothing but first place on a list of people he intended to murder within days of completing his preparations. The names that followed hers on this death list provided a comprehensive catalogue of everyone who possessed significant influence within the imperial administration or who might theoretically be capable of organizing resistance to Commodus's divine authority. Eclectus the Chamberlain, whose daily management of imperial schedules and appointments made him one of the most powerful men in Rome, was marked for elimination alongside his assistant Narcissus, who served as the emperor's wrestling partner and physical trainer. Quintus Aemilius Latus, the Praetorian prefect, who commanded the military forces responsible for protecting the emperor's life and maintaining order within the capital, occupied a prominent position on the list, along with several of his subordinate officers who might be expected to resist orders to execute their commanding officer. The document continued with senators, provincial governors, palace officials, and even household servants, whose access to imperial quarters or knowledge of court routines made them potential security risks in the emperor's increasingly paranoid imagination. The psychological impact of this discovery on Marcia was profound and immediate, transforming her understanding of her relationship with Commodus and her position within the imperial household. The realization that the man she had loved and served faithfully for so many years viewed her as an enemy to be eliminated rather than a partner to be protected shattered whatever illusions she might have maintained about his capacity for normal human emotions or rational decision-making processes. The practical implications of her discovery were equally devastating, as Marcia understood immediately that she and her fellow conspirators had only hours or at most days to organize effective resistance before Commodus implemented his murderous plans. The emperor's habit of acting quickly once he had made important decisions meant that delay would be fatal, while the comprehensive nature of his death list suggested that conventional forms of palace intrigue or political maneuvering would be insufficient to ensure their survival. The recruitment of Eclectus and Latus as additional conspirators proved remarkably straightforward once Marcia shared her discovery with these men, both of whom had been growing increasingly concerned about the emperor's mental state and the implications of his erratic behavior for the stability of the imperial system. The Chamberlain's position gave him detailed knowledge of Commodus's daily routines and security arrangements, while the Praetorian prefect's military authority would be essential for preventing immediate retaliation by loyal guards once the assassination had been completed. The planning phase of the conspiracy revealed the sophisticated understanding that years of intimate contact with imperial routines had provided these individuals about Commodus's habits, preferences, and vulnerabilities. They knew precisely when he bathed, what he ate and drank, how he spent his private hours, and which servants had access to his person during different parts of his daily schedule. This detailed knowledge would prove essential for organizing an assassination attempt that would have multiple opportunities for success, while minimizing the risk of detection by guards or household staff who remained loyal to the emperor. The selection of poison as the conspirators' primary weapon reflected both practical considerations and the psychological constraints that even desperate individuals felt about directly confronting someone they had served and lived with for many years. The emperor's well-documented fondness for wine provided an ideal delivery mechanism that would allow Marcia to administer the fatal dose without arousing suspicion, while the timing of the attempt could be carefully calculated to coincide with Commodus's usual pattern of heavy drinking that would both accelerate the poison's effects and provide plausible explanation for any initial symptoms that might appear. The specific substance chosen for the assassination attempt was obtained through the medical contacts that palace staff maintained for treating various ailments and injuries that were common among household servants and imperial guards. The poison selected was known to be both highly toxic and relatively tasteless when properly mixed, while its effects were sufficiently rapid to prevent the emperor from identifying his attackers and summoning help before the fatal dose had completed its work. The preparation of the poisoned wine required careful attention to factors of dosage, taste, and timing that reflected the conspirators' determination to ensure success while avoiding detection by guards or servants who might sample the drink before it reached the emperor. Marcia's years of experience mixing and serving Commodus's evening refreshments gave her intimate knowledge of his preferences for specific types and strengths of wine, while her access to the imperial wine cellars allowed her to select a particularly potent and aromatic vintage that would help mask any unusual flavors introduced by the toxic additives. December 31st was chosen as the assassination date because the New Year celebrations would provide natural cover for unusual activity within the imperial household, while creating a sense of festive relaxation that might lower the emperor's guard and make him less likely to notice subtle changes in the behavior of his associates. The approaching holiday also created a natural deadline for implementing Commodus's own murderous plans, as he had indicated his intention to begin the executions listed on his death tablet during the first days of the new year. The evening of the assassination attempt began, with Commodus following his customary routine of gladiatorial training, administrative consultations, and personal grooming that occupied most of his late afternoon and early evening hours. The emperor appeared to be in excellent spirits, perhaps anticipating the elimination of his enemies or simply enjoying the physical satisfactions that had become his primary source of pleasure during the isolation and paranoia of his later years. His interactions with Marcia during the early part of the evening revealed no signs of suspicion or awareness that his death list had been discovered, as he maintained the same casual affection and trust that had characterized their relationship for years. The emperor's confidence in her loyalty remained absolute, providing the conspirators with crucial psychological advantage as they prepared to implement their deadly plan. The administration of the poison demonstrated both Marcia's intimate knowledge of the emperor's drinking habits and her remarkable self-control under pressure, as she managed to maintain normal conversation and behavior while serving wine that she knew contained a fatal dose of toxic substances. The timing of the poisoning was carefully calculated to occur after Commodus had consumed enough alcohol to lower his alertness, while ensuring that sufficient time remained for the poison to complete its work before he would normally retire for the evening. The first indications that something was seriously wrong appeared within minutes of Commodus consuming the poisoned wine, as he began to experience violent nausea and stomach cramping that indicated that toxic substances were beginning to affect his digestive system. Initially, these symptoms appeared to be nothing more than the ordinary consequences of excessive drinking that the emperor had experienced many times before. But their rapid intensification soon made it clear that something far more serious was occurring than simple intoxication. The emperor's attempts to vomit provided partial relief from the poison's effects, while also purging significant quantities of the toxic material from his system before it could be fully absorbed into his bloodstream. His physical conditioning, developed through years of gladiatorial training and athletic competition, gave him greater resistance to the poison's effects than the conspirators had anticipated, while the various antidotes and preventive medications he regularly consumed as protection against assassination attempts further reduced the lethal dose's effectiveness. As Commodus's condition began to stabilize rather than deteriorate, the conspirators realized with growing horror that their carefully planned assassination was failing and that their own lives would be forfeit if the emperor recovered sufficiently to identify his attackers. The poison that should have killed him within an hour was instead being gradually overcome by his physical strength and medical precautions, leaving them exposed to discovery and certain execution if they did not take immediate action to complete their murderous mission. The decision to recruit Narcissus for the final phase of the assassination was made in desperate recognition that direct physical violence would be necessary to finish what poison had failed to accomplish. The wrestling champion's presence in the imperial quarters during evening hours would not arouse suspicion among guards who were accustomed to seeing him attend the emperor during his exercise routines, while his intimate knowledge of Commodus's physical capabilities and vulnerabilities would be essential for overpowering him even in his weakened condition. The approach to Commodus's bathing chamber required careful coordination between the conspirators to ensure that Narcissus could reach his target without alerting the guards who maintained constant vigilance over the emperor's safety. Eclectus used his authority as chamberlain to adjust staffing arrangements and dismiss unnecessary attendants from the immediate area, while ensuring that the Praetorian guards remained at their regular posts outside the building, where they would be unable to observe or intervene in the final confrontation that was about to unfold. The confrontation between Commodus and Narcissus in the steamy confines of the imperial bathing chamber represented the ultimate collision between the emperor's delusions of divine invincibility and the brutal reality of human mortality. As the wrestler who had spent countless hours training with his imperial partner now employed that intimate knowledge to systematically destroy the man who had believed himself to be immortal. The setting for this final struggle was grimly appropriate, as the luxurious facilities designed to pamper the emperor's physical vanity became the stage for his destruction at the hands of someone who understood his bodily strengths and weaknesses better than anyone else alive. The emperor's condition when Narcissus entered the bathing chamber was precarious but not hopeless, as the partial effects of the poison had left him, weakened and disoriented, but still capable of recognizing threats and attempting to defend himself against attack. Years of gladiatorial training and paranoid alertness had not been entirely overcome by the toxic substances in his system, and he retained sufficient physical coordination to pose a genuine challenge to anyone who attempted to overpower him through conventional means. Commodus's initial reaction to Narcissus's approach revealed both his weakened state and his continued capacity for rational thought, as he immediately understood that the wrestler's presence in his private bathing chamber during this particular evening could not be coincidental. The emperor, who had survived one assassination attempt through poison, was now confronting the realization that his enemies had prepared multiple methods for ensuring his death, and that his supposed divine protection had proven insufficient to save him from the mundane reality of human conspiracy. The physical struggle that followed was intense but relatively brief, as Commodus's disadvantageous position and reduced capabilities prevented him from effectively utilizing the combat skills he had developed during years of gladiatorial performance. The emperor's nudity and the slippery surfaces of the bathing chamber further compromised his ability to maintain balance or generate leverage against an opponent who possessed superior technique and the crucial advantage of preparation and initiative. Narcissus's approach to the assassination revealed both his professional expertise and his psychological preparation for the grim task he had been assigned, as he employed sophisticated wrestling techniques specifically designed to overcome an opponent's resistance while minimizing the risk of escape or successful counterattack. The wrestler's years of training with Commodus had provided him with detailed understanding of the emperor's preferred defensive strategies and physical limitations, knowledge that proved invaluable in the confined space where conventional gladiatorial skills would be less effective than precise application of anatomical knowledge. The specific method employed to kill Commodus involved a combination of pressure point manipulation and sustained compression that gradually restricted blood flow to his brain while preventing him from calling for help or breaking free from his attacker's grip. This technique required both considerable physical strength and sophisticated understanding of human anatomy, as Narcissus needed to maintain precise pressure against specific locations on the emperor's neck and throat, while adjusting his grip to compensate for his victim's struggling and attempts to escape. The duration of the strangulation process allowed time for psychological reflection that must have been agonizing for both participants, as Commodus gradually realized that his divine pretensions would not save him, while Narcissus methodically completed a task that would transform him from a loyal servant into the killer of someone he had known intimately for years. The emperor's final attempts to invoke his supposed divine status provided no protection against the practical application of superior force by someone who had never believed in his supernatural claims. The silence that surrounded this crucial confrontation reflected the conspirators' need to avoid detection by guards and household staff, who remained unaware that an assassination was taking place within the palace complex. The emperor, who had always been surrounded by crowds of flatterers and sycophants, was dying alone except for the presence of the man who was killing him, abandoned by the very people whose loyalty and devotion he had taken for granted throughout his increasingly isolated and paranoid reign. The completion of the strangulation required several minutes of sustained pressure, during which Narcissus maintained his grip despite the psychological strain of deliberately ending the life of someone he had served and trained with for years. The physical evidence of the struggle was carefully managed by the conspirators to support their planned explanation that the emperor had died from the effects of poison rather than from deliberate strangulation, as they understood that the political implications of Commodus's death would depend partly on the apparent circumstances of his demise. The immediate aftermath of the assassination required split-second timing and coordination among the conspirators as they worked to secure the emperor's body, control access to his private quarters, and begin implementing their plans for managing the political transition that would follow the announcement of his death. The success of their conspiracy depended not only on killing Commodus, but also on preventing immediate retaliation from loyal guards or household members who might attempt to avenge their master's murder. The removal of Commodus's body from the bathing chamber and its subsequent preparation for public viewing involved elaborate staging designed to conceal the true circumstances of his death, while supporting the narrative that the public viewing involved conspirators intended to present to the Roman people and the imperial administration. The emperor, who had devoted so much attention to theatrical presentation during his life, was becoming the subject of one final performance designed to serve the political needs of those who had destroyed him. The psychological relief experienced by the conspirators, once they confirmed that Commodus was actually dead, must have been enormous, as they had been living under the constant threat of discovery and execution for hours while implementing their desperate plan. The success of their assassination represented not only personal survival, but also the elimination of a source of systematic terror and corruption that had been poisoning Roman society for more than a decade. The immediate aftermath of Commodus's assassination on the night of December 31st, 192, unleashed a cascade of political, social, and military consequences that would fundamentally transform the Roman Empire and demonstrate how completely 12 years of tyrannical rule had undermined the institutional foundations that had previously provided stability and continuity during imperial transitions. The death of the last Antonine emperor marked not merely the end of one man's reign, but the collapse of an entire dynastic system that had governed Rome for nearly a century, ushering in an era of civil warfare and political chaos that would consume thousands of lives and permanently alter the character of imperial rule. The conspirators' immediate priority following the successful assassination was to control the narrative surrounding Commodus's death, while simultaneously securing their own positions within whatever new governmental structure would emerge from the crisis that his elimination had created. Marcia, Eclectus, and Latus understood that their survival depended not only on the successful removal of the emperor, but also on their ability to present his death as the inevitable consequence of divine judgment rather than the result of human conspiracy, thereby positioning themselves as instruments of justice rather than mere assassins seeking personal advantage or political advancement. The selection of Publius Helvius Pertinax as Commodus's successor represented a calculated attempt by the conspirators to restore traditional forms of imperial governance, while ensuring that the new emperor would be sufficiently grateful for their support to protect them from retaliation by any surviving loyalists of the previous regime. Pertinax possessed exactly the qualifications that Commodus had lacked. Extensive military experience gained through successful campaigns on multiple frontiers, proven administrative competence demonstrated during his tenure as governor of several important provinces, and genuine respect for Roman legal traditions and constitutional principles that had been systematically violated during the previous 12 years. The new emperor's career trajectory had provided him with intimate understanding of the empire's most pressing problems and the reforms necessary to address the institutional damage that Commodus's reign had inflicted on governmental efficiency and military effectiveness. His service as governor of Syria, Britain, and several Danubian provinces had given him practical experience managing complex administrative challenges while dealing with barbarian threats, economic difficulties, and the corruption that had spread throughout the imperial system during the previous decade. But the very virtues that made Pertinax an ideal choice for restoring effective government also ensured that he would encounter fierce resistance from the corrupt interests that had flourished under his predecessor's chaotic rule. The Praetorian Guard, which had been systematically corrupted by Commodus's lavish payments and arbitrary rewards, viewed the new emperor's attempts to restore military discipline and fiscal responsibility as direct threats to their privileged position within the imperial system. These soldiers had grown accustomed to treating the imperial treasury as their personal source of enrichment, rather than as a resource to be carefully managed for the benefit of the entire empire. Commodus's practice of distributing enormous donatives to secure military loyalty had created expectations that no responsible emperor could fulfill without bankrupting the state, while his arbitrary promotion policies had elevated incompetent individuals to positions of authority they were incapable of fulfilling through legitimate military service. When Pertinax attempted to reduce the Praetorian Guard's donatives to sustainable levels and impose professional standards on their behavior, he encountered the same violent resistance that had characterized their response to any attempt to limit their privileges during the previous reign. The soldiers who had willingly participated in Commodus's most destructive policies were not prepared to accept the restoration of accountability and discipline that effective military service required. The assassination of Pertinax, after only 87 days of rule, demonstrated that the removal of Commodus had not addressed the underlying corruption that made effective governance impossible within the existing institutional framework. The soldiers who murdered the reform-minded emperor were not motivated by political principle or dynastic loyalty, but by simple greed and resistance to any restoration of the professional standards that legitimate military service demanded. The Praetorian Guards, who participated in Pertinax's assassination, understood perfectly well that they were destroying the last hope for peaceful restoration of effective imperial government, but their immediate financial interests outweighed any concern they might have felt for the long-term stability of the empire they were sworn to protect. The institution that had been created to defend imperial authority against external threats had become the primary source of internal instability and governmental dysfunction. The subsequent auction of the imperial throne to Didius Julianus, who purchased the position from the Praetorian Guard for the enormous sum of 25,000 sestertii per soldier, represented the complete degradation of imperial dignity and the transformation of the highest office in the Roman world into a commodity to be bought and sold like any other form of property. This unprecedented transaction revealed how thoroughly Commodus's reign had destroyed traditional concepts of imperial legitimacy, reducing political authority to a matter of financial negotiation rather than constitutional principle or popular acceptance. The bidding process itself was conducted with shameless openness that shocked even contemporary observers who had grown accustomed to corruption and venality in imperial politics. Didius Julianus and his rival Titus Flavius Sulpicianus literally competed to see who could offer larger bribes to the Praetorian Guards, while the soldiers themselves treated the proceedings as an entertaining spectacle rather than a solemn occasion for selecting their supreme commander and the ruler of the civilized world. The symbolic significance of this auction extended far beyond its immediate political consequences to encompass broader questions about the nature of legitimate authority and the relationship between military force and governmental dottle. Legitimacy that would plague the Roman Empire for the remaining centuries of its existence. The precedent established by the Praetorian Guard's sale of imperial power to the highest bidder would inspire numerous future attempts to achieve political advancement through military rebellion and financial corruption, rather than through constitutional processes or popular support. The civil wars that followed Didius Julianus's purchase of the throne involved armies throughout the empire, as provincial commanders recognized that central authority had completely collapsed and that imperial power could be claimed by anyone capable of marshalling sufficient military force to march on Rome and eliminate their competitors. The simultaneous emergence of multiple rival claimants to imperial authority created conflicts that would devastate the very territories they sought to control, while consuming resources that should have been devoted to defending Roman frontiers against barbarian invasion. Septimius Severus in Pannonia commanded legions that had remained loyal to traditional concepts of Roman honor and military professionalism, while his rivals Pescennius Niger in Syria and Clodius Albinus in Britain possessed similar advantages in terms of troop quality and regional support. Each of these commanders could present legitimate claims to imperial authority based on their military achievements and administrative competence, but their simultaneous marches on Rome transformed the empire into a battleground where competing armies fought for supremacy, while civilian populations suffered the consequences of warfare they had done nothing to provoke. The economic consequences of these civil wars were catastrophic and long-lasting, as resources that should have been devoted to infrastructure maintenance, frontier defense, and productive investment were instead consumed by military campaigns that served no constructive purpose beyond determining which general would possess the title of emperor. Provinces that had enjoyed centuries of peace and prosperity found themselves transformed into conflict zones where soldiers requisitioned supplies, destroyed property, and disrupted trade networks that had taken generations to develop. The social impact of this prolonged warfare extended throughout Roman society, as families were separated, communities were destroyed, and traditional institutions were overwhelmed by the demands of supporting competing military forces. The empire that had provided unprecedented opportunities for economic advancement and cultural development was becoming a source of danger and instability that threatened the basic survival of its own citizens. The Year of the Five Emperors, as historians would later term this catastrophic period, demonstrated how quickly even the most successful political system could collapse once its institutional foundations had been sufficiently undermined by incompetent or malicious leadership. The Roman Empire, that had seemed unshakably powerful during Marcus Aurelius's reign, was revealed to be fatally dependent on the competence and restraint of its individual rulers, lacking the constitutional safeguards necessary to prevent or contain the damage that tyrannical emperors could inflict on governmental effectiveness and social stability. The eventual victory of Septimius Severus brought an end to the immediate civil warfare, but also marked the beginning of a fundamentally different form of imperial government that reflected lessons learned from the chaos that had followed Commodus's death. The new emperor's reliance on military force rather than senatorial cooperation, his systematic expansion of the imperial bureaucracy, and his deliberate elevation of provincial populations to positions of authority represented adaptations designed to prevent the institutional collapse that had made the recent crisis possible. But these changes also represented permanent losses of the constitutional traditions and civic virtues that had originally made Roman expansion and prosperity possible, as the empire gradually transformed from a system based on law and custom into a military autocracy dependent entirely on the personal loyalty of professional soldiers who were more interested in immediate rewards than in long-term institutional stability. The story of Emperor Commodus reveals fundamental truths about the relationship between character and authority that transcend the specific circumstances of second-century Rome, demonstrating how individual psychological pathology can corrupt even the most sophisticated governmental systems when it is combined with unlimited power and inadequate institutional constraints. The transformation of Marcus Aurelius's son from a privileged aristocrat into a delusional tyrant who demanded worship as a god, while murdering citizens for entertainment, illustrates the speed with which absolute authority can corrupt personalities that lack the moral foundation necessary to exercise such power responsibly. The systematic nature of Commodus's descent into madness reveals that his tyranny was not the result of sudden mental illness or external influences, but rather the logical consequence of a personality structure that was fundamentally incompatible with the responsibilities of leadership, yet was never subjected to the corrective pressures that might have modified his behavior before it became permanently destructive. The emperor, who grew up surrounded by flatterers and sycophants, who had every incentive to encourage his worst impulses while suppressing any criticism that might have helped him develop realistic self-awareness, was almost inevitably destined to become the monster he ultimately became. The enabling mechanisms that allowed Commodus's tyranny to persist for more than a decade reveal the complex web of complicity that authoritarian systems require to function effectively, as his reign depended not only on his personal capacity for violence and intimidation, but also on the willingness of thousands of individuals and institutions to participate in activities they recognized as fundamentally corrupt and destructive. The senators who voted honors to an emperor they despised, the palace officials who facilitated his murderous spectacles, the gladiatorial trainers who helped him stage rigged contests against helpless victims, and the Praetorian guards who protected a ruler they knew to be destroying the empire, all bear responsibility for creating the conditions that made systematic oppression possible. The role of fear in maintaining authoritarian control becomes particularly apparent when examining the behavior of individuals who possessed the knowledge, access, and authority necessary to resist Commodus's tyranny, but chose instead to participate in his crimes rather than risk their own safety by opposing him. The conspiracy that finally ended his reign demonstrates both the potential for resistance to tyrannical authority and the tragic reality that such resistance often emerges only when those with the power to act discover that they themselves have become targets for elimination. Marcia, Eclectus, and Latus possessed the access and authority necessary to remove the emperor years before they actually took action, but their personal safety under his protection prevented them from recognizing the broader moral imperative to act against systematic injustice that was destroying thousands of other lives. The lesson here extends beyond individual moral failure to encompass the institutional and cultural factors that encourage or permit ordinary people to participate in systems they recognize as fundamentally corrupt, while convincing themselves that their complicity is justified by circumstances beyond their control. The methods required to assassinate someone who had consolidated absolute power while surrounding himself with military protection and eliminating organized opposition reveal the particular challenges that resistance movements face when confronting well-established authoritarian regimes. The need for multiple assassination attempts on a single night, the requirement for insider knowledge and access, and the desperate improvisation that characterized the final phases of the conspiracy all illustrate how difficult it can be to remove leaders who have successfully concentrated power while maintaining effective security arrangements and eliminating potential sources of organized resistance. The civil wars that followed Commodus's death provide sobering evidence that the removal of tyrannical rulers does not automatically restore the institutional health and social cohesion that authoritarian rule systematically destroys through its corruption of legal traditions, military discipline, and public morality. The Roman Empire's descent into chaos reflected deeper structural damage that 12 years of arbitrary government had inflicted on the governmental systems, economic relationships, and cultural values that had previously sustained imperial stability and prosperity. The lesson for modern observers is that authoritarian damage to democratic institutions may persist long after individual authoritarians have been removed from power, as the corruption of legal processes, the militarization of political relationships, and the degradation of civic virtue create lasting impediments to the restoration of effective constitutional government. The institutional changes implemented by Septimius Severus to prevent the recurrence of the chaos that Commodus had created also represented permanent losses of republican traditions and constitutional limitations that could never be fully recovered. The long-term consequences of Commodus's reign extended far beyond his immediate victims to influence fundamental changes in Roman government, law, and society that would define the empire for the remaining centuries of its existence and ultimately contribute to its eventual collapse. The militarization of imperial administration, the decline of senatorial influence, the expansion of autocratic authority, and the erosion of civic participation all represented adaptations to prevent the recurrence of the chaos that his rule had created. But these adaptations also eliminated many of the sources of strength and resilience that had originally made Roman expansion and prosperity possible. The preservation of detailed historical accounts of Commodus's reign by writers like Cassius Dio and Herodian reflects the importance that ancient observers placed on documenting the warning signs and consequences of tyrannical rule for future generations who would face similar challenges in protecting their own political systems against the abuse of power. These historians understood that the specific details of imperial corruption, public complicity, and ultimate collapse contained lessons that transcended their particular historical moment and spoke to universal patterns of political behavior that would remain relevant as long as human beings organize themselves into governments and institutions. The ultimate significance of this ancient story lies not in its exotic details or historical curiosities, but in its revelation of timeless patterns of behavior that emerge whenever individuals or institutions are granted authority without corresponding accountability or meaningful limitations. The psychological dynamics that transformed a philosopher's son into a murderous tyrant, the enabling mechanisms that allowed his behavior to continue unchecked for more than a decade, and the institutional collapse that followed his removal, all provide insights that remain applicable to understanding how democratic societies can protect themselves against the eternal threat of those who would abuse power for personal benefit rather than public service. The corruption of power is not an aberration that affects only certain types of individuals or political systems, but rather a fundamental human tendency that requires constant vigilance and institutional safeguards to prevent, contain. The death of Commodus marked the end of one particular manifestation of tyrannical authority, but the forces that created him and enabled his rise to power represent permanent features of human political organization that must be understood and addressed by every generation that hopes to preserve freedom, justice, and human dignity against those who would sacrifice these values for their own advancement. The story of Rome's mad emperor serves as an eternal warning about the fragility of civilized government and the speed with which even the most successful political systems can be destroyed by leaders who refuse to accept moral limitations on their exercise of power. The lessons learned from his reign and its violent conclusion remain as relevant today as they were 2,000 years ago, reminding us that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance against those who would use public authority for private gratification, while destroying the institutions and values that make civilized life possible.